All right, welcome back to the show, everybody. And let me begin, as I always do, talking about why I started this show. It was begun as a way to encourage people to study their own games, to annotate them as a path for their own improvement. And I want to say it's grown in that not only do we have more submissions, but more importantly, we have a lot more people submitting games with meaningful annotations. And so I feel like I'm contributing a little bit by that. And with that said, the this was the first time I felt like I might not cover everyone who had a worthy submission. I think I have 18 games today. It's a lot for me also just to hold in my head to think about what's going on in each of those. So if I missed your game today, I apologize. I try to get to everybody, and I think I kind of sort of tried to pick the 18 best games, if that was possible, or best annotated. I don't mean best games. I'll cover any game of any level on this show. It just needs to be annotated. And the since we last spoke, last time, by the way, I had this horrible like COVID thing. I saw a clip of myself, and I was just life was ending. So I'm glad to be out of that. Anyway, since that time, I managed to produce a short video that kind of captured my chess philosophy in regards to chess improvement. So I'm going to post that in the chat box. You can find it too just by typing my name into YouTube or something like that. Okay, so let's get into the games. And as the first game today, I picked a game that is kind of interesting to me. So this is my good friend John Donaldson, I am is white, against Cam, who we have had on the show before. And I identified with this game personally because here John is, and he is playing someone who is technically a much lower rated player, but is finding it difficult. And I identify with that a lot because in my show with the road back to 2500, which I usually do at this time, but I'm now going to do Friday at 11 Eastern. In that show, I've talked a lot about how hard it is coming back, or just any times, playing in these modern tournaments where you have to beat players who are lower rated. In this case, John is 400 points higher, which means he has to score, I think, 9 out of 10 just to hold his rating. And when you look at how close this game is, you get a sense of how hard it is for John and players like myself to beat Cam 9 out of 10. When you look at this game, it seems like it's basically impossible. So let's take a look. And normally I have the person who submitted the game on the bottom, but I chose John this time. I'm sorry, Cam. I'm on John's side on this one. I identify with the struggle. Okay, so now F3 is what John plays, and it's got to be a mildly inaccurate. I'm going to call it that. It can't be terrible, but it also can't be the best move. Let's leave it at that, and we might come back to it. Of course, the more normal move is bishop e2. And so for Cam, one of the nice things for f3 is I'm not certain, but he probably was a little bit out of, it throws a little bit of a loop at black, like why f3 and why is it maybe a little bit dangerous. And we'll see John has some very highfalutin ideas for white here. So Cam, of course, could have played bishop g7. And so we're going to get this position. And rook c1. And queen a5, b3, rook f c8, and now bishop d3. And I did that kind of fast, but I feel that's a pretty natural progression from the opening. And bishop d3 is also weird because normally you would put it on e2. And to Cam's mind anyway, this has something to do with stopping or making f5 a little bit harder to play. Maybe, I don't know. In any case, maybe it also doesn't make that big of a difference. The drama about the bishop on d3 is that, when the knight comes to d7, it's going to tag the bishop on one of those squares, and so it's more loose than it would like to be. But okay, I feel like this is a good place to start, and I feel like Cam's next move walks into John's intentions. Let's look first at what Black plays, and then we'll talk about maybe what Black should have done. After a6, John went for the endgame, which is now forced because of knight b6. And I'm going to say that I like John's position here a lot. I like it a lot because we have, in a lot of ways, an extra piece. The king is an extra piece on d2, and the king on g8 is really going to have a hard time playing a role in the game. Now, the game's not even close to over, and we're going to get into it. But Cam doesn't make any notes here, but I thought this was a critical moment and that Black should have played knight d7. After which, I think he is totally fine. And on knight d5, I think you should just go back. And there are a lot of games that the expert on the accelerated dragon, Eugene Perelstein, has played here. And the very instructive plan, really, which is maybe I will just take on d5. Maybe you'll get the two bishops. But I'm aiming for a position with a knight on d7 versus the bishop on d3. And Eugene's done some crazy stuff. He's done stuff like queen f8, h5, king h7, bishop h6, just to get the exchange of the dark squared bishops, and then and he takes on d5. So that shows the determination to get that kind of plan. Okay, so let's look at the end game. Now, I thought one of the reasons I thought this game was so interesting was that even though John got what he wanted, things didn't go as easily as maybe they should have. All right. Now, John's first move is very thematic. First move from this position. And that is g4. And this might look strange. I do not think it is about stopping f5, though that's maybe a side benefit. What g4, to my mind, is about is actually keeping the Black king pinned down. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and show you guys a slightly different variation. So, for example, bishop e2, knight takes, queen takes, bishop g7, bishop d2, castles, queen e3. If you look up this position with Paul Karras as white, there are some very instructive games, instructive for me anyway, where later he's going to do a similar thing where we're going to go to some kind of ending and we're going to play things like g4 to crimp the Black king and the king side. And it's very interesting, and it's going to come into play here too, where, excuse me, I don't want that one. We're going to get it here too, where white, if he has an advantage, is the king and, the grip onto the Black king side. Now, that said, maybe there were better moves in g4, but let's leave it at g4. Rook a b8. And now another kind of critical decision. John goes back, and I spent a little time on here because part of me, for the most part, doesn't completely believe in the b5 break because that is really like it's in a lot of ways our side of the board because our king is an extra piece on that field. So I just going through my mind, rook c2 also looks possible and yada yada. But let's look at what happened. So knight c3, knight c5, bishop e2, And let's read Cam's notes. By the way, really great notes in a lot of games. So I don't always get to read the notes, but what I've done is I've put them up there for people to read on their own. And you can also get a flavor of, I think, how well a lot of people are really annotating their games. By the way, if you're interested in submitting the game and you're intimidated or want to have a sense of what it means, looking at the annotations and going through the games is a very good way to do it. And if you go back, these chess.com forums where the games are submitted, you can go back, I think years now, we have people's annotations. So it's a really great database. Okay, so let's read. He says, King f8. This is the first move that I really didn't know what to do. After the game, my opponent suggested b5, and that seems reasonable and logical. Okay, now King f8 also is at least a little bit logical, but you get a sense actually of how the king has grief, the black king. That's your problem piece in this position. And John said something to the effect, after the game, the postmortem, that you can't just sit in these kinds of positions. So let's look at the variation. b5 takes. I do think white needs to take. Takes. And watch what he says. I thought this just lost a pawn, but if we continue a little further, bishop d7, knight c3, rook a8, and now it's a little bit of a grief. And then Cam writes, with some sort of weird balance. The bishop pair isn't too scary, and the knight must be worth something. Interesting. Okay. One thing I've done is I always organize the games into themes. And the first two games we're going to do today, this one and the next, are the question of the two bishop advantage in the endgame. And this is the first one where we kind of have to wonder about the bishops and how strong they are. Now, I want to say at my first glance, it looks to me like I'd rather be white. And it's not just the bishops, but the better king. And maybe, if black is going to say that he is equal here, there needs to be some kind of follow-up to rook c2. And one piece of practical advice I have is if you want to improve your chess, studying a position like this just by yourself is fantastic, because you'll really get a sense of what a real ending is, not just some ending where somebody's telling you, like, how do you win it or whatever, right? Or what's the best move. No, there's going to be lots of different ideas and lots of different plans in a position like this. And the first one is going to be, well, what does black do? I don't know. It's already kind of an interesting question. Now, obviously, he's gone down a good line already, and I don't mean to chastise. It's a pretty good line. I am doing the biggest analysis of my life. I'm on page, I don't know, I'm past page 30 of handwritten analysis. It usually doesn't go that long. But I just want to give a plug for the fact that if you do this kind of analysis, it will make you powerful. And I'm noticing it now, and I kind of wish I had done more of it earlier. So I'm chastising myself here as well. Okay, but the interesting thing, let me say about this, about King f8 versus b5, is really if you play b5 here, especially with white having the better king, you're already sensing that there's drama and that you need to do something about it. So so what I guess I'm saying is, if John tells you you need to play b5, it's because he feels there's a sense of urgency in the black position, because white is going to slowly put the crimp on the black king and the king side with moves like h4, h5. Okay, so here we go. h6, and now a move that I guess is inaccurate with b4. And one of the interesting things to me about this move b4, and I put myself in John's shoes, is that it feels that black has given us just way too much time and is just kind of sitting on his hands. And so it feels natural then to say to yourself, okay, h6 seemed weird. King f8 seemed weird. Now it's time for me to hurt the guy, right? But yeah, one of the challenges is that to play a position like this, you need massive patience in how, in dealing with it. My first instinct is that rook c2 gives white a very nice advantage. Not even close to over or anything, of course, but it gives a nice advantage. Okay, so b4, knight d7, knight d5, and right, it feels like white is losing his mind a little bit because it's not clear what knight d5 necessarily does, and at some point black really might want to take the thing on d5. So Cam writes that a5 would challenge the white setup, and again this would be a pawn sacrifice, and you would only do this, right, if you had come to the conclusion that there was urgency in the position. I definitely think white is better here, though, and the main reason is that the king is better. The pawn shmon, right? Pawn shmon, but the king is better. Okay, so John, though, has a moment of complacency, which feels a little bit in tune with the moves b4, knight d5. And this is why it's so tough to beat the lower-rated players, because in a position like this, you can say to yourself, oh, I'm in control, everything's okay, yada, yada. And he needs to play something like rook c2, and b6 lulls John into a sense of complacency because he's like, well, what is black doing? And then I'm sure he missed a5. And now all of a sudden, the position isn't so easy, because if you play a3, and a3 is the only move to keep control over the c5 square, and maybe he shouldn't do it, but if he wants, if he wants to pursue this dream that he's been nursing, then that's the move to make. So f4 I also thought was unnecessary. We need to play rook c2. All right, so that's the problem, and now we're going to get this position. Now, bishop d5 definitely felt too early. Maybe it doesn't wreck anything, but there's also no rush in taking the thing. Okay, and here's John's idea. And notice what he did is he lost control of the position, but played a3 anyway, and saw this coming, and decided this is the way to go. To try to throw black off balance. And I definitely now would much rather be black. And the next coming moves are real interesting in that, right, I just want to say I love the black position. It's not just the beautiful passed a pawn, but we've got the blockade of the c5 square. And the bishop on e2 doesn't look great. The knight on d7 has squares. And in general, in this opening, I feel like what we're doing is we're trying to work against the bishop on e2. And very soon here, a bishop is going to show up around c5. And we're going to demand that white give us his good bishop. And that's one of the key ideas in this opening. By the way, I'm spending way too long on this game. I'm spending way too long on this game. I got 18 games to cover, but I guess I'm having an idea with this show that I'll take one game and spend a little bit more time on it than the others, just to showcase one game. And I promise I'll get on with it here. Okay. Why can you not sit in these positions? Well, because John was going to play g4, f4, g5, and squeeze the life out of him. And if you want a great example, those Keres games from back in the day are pretty good ones. Okay, now bishop b4. This can't be bad if king d1 is his best move. But one thing about it that I felt a little bit worried, if I can use that word, is that it felt to me like we are not seeing that bishop c5 is really where we want to go. We want to trade off that dark square bishop as, sooner rather than later. So bishop b4 isn't bad, and now things get weird. Now, black's move that he does is it's definitely a little bit creative, okay? And let's just look first what he does. And the idea is, to control the queening square, a1, and to sack the pawn. And here he probably does have, let's call it compensation, sure. But I think here he's better, so I think he should be doing better than compensation. And I think his fear is interesting here. Let's talk about it. So king g7, I feel like that's at least the right move from a human perspective. Bishop d4, f6 is what he writes, and then he said g5, and all of a sudden my king feels funny. Now, maybe it does. But here's an interesting point. Why not knight e5? That looks very strong to me. Very strong indeed. Because the bad news for white is that if he wants to survive this position, he can never give up the dark square bishop. So, very soon, well, we can do all kinds of things, honestly. But bishop c5, I assume, is coming. a4 is coming. And I don't see any play for white at all. Now, maybe I'm missing something, but yeah, I just don't see it. So I think the prejudice was the pinned piece and maybe like the bishop e5 de structure. But I want to stress that is fantastic for black because you own the blockading squares with c5, and this bishop is a golden goose that really, if you could sack a pawn to get that bishop, I think, well, we might. In fact, let me just check myself when I say that. So let's do a thought experiment. Say here, would I give up this pawn to trade off this bishop? That's an interesting thought. Black would definitely be better, much better. Okay. Well, let's continue with the game. Bishop c3 was at least kind of clever from a positional standpoint. So we give the h-pawn, and of course it's a little scary now because white has a passed pawn on the h-file. And this is an interesting similar mistake. Now, it's not a mistake in the sense that when you played bishop c3, that was your intention, right? To keep the dark square bishop. And it's kind of evil, right? you got the a pawn running down. But of course, as you write, bishop g7 was probably correct. And then the point is that you want to trade that thing, that dark square bishop. Okay. John now takes, and this is another interesting position for me with John's decision. He decides to go into the straight bishop ending, and maybe this isn't the best, but I think his notion is that if he does this, the a-pawn will be defanged. Like it'll be harder for black to push the a-pawn in a meaningful way. The rook, and this is just a bad situation, it's hard for the rook to deal with this guy, right, with this bishop here. So this is perhaps lazy, but it presents black with some interesting problems. Now, I'm sure black is fine here. And Cam writes bishop f6. Sure, I'm sure there's multiple things you can do. There's really not a lot of danger. But watch how John wins this thing. Yeah, watch how John wins this thing. And it has a little bit to do with the two bishops. And since it's the theme of this game, this ending, and the next one, let me just say something obvious about the two bishops. And maybe this is just too obvious for some people out there, but I think since it was something that I didn't quite grasp until much later, just maybe I grasped it intuitively, but I'd never just stated it out loud, was that when you take your standard bishop, let's put him here, right? And he controls 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I think if you put him on d4, it's even more. The knight can only control 8, right, at the most. Like the d7 knight controls 6 squares at the moment. So the bishops, once the board open, are already stronger than the knight. The simple drawback of the bishop, though, is that it controls only half the board. You get a friend on the board, like bishop on f1, you're doing great. Now, there's an interesting problem for white. One of his bishops is dramatically better than the other. So we're going to see, though, that John puts his bishops to work, the bishop on the light square bishop to work in a great way. So white or black messes around a little bit, and the knight should definitely go to c5. And all of a sudden, it's getting a little creaky here for black, because it's not just, we're going to see that John's going to be attacking the a-pawn, but he's also going to be dreaming of an invasion. And so things fall apart here kind of dramatically quickly. King a4 and bishop d1. And notice there's just a simple thing here, that if white wants to play bishop c2, we're stopping the a-pawn moving, or at least dissuading it from moving. And then after bishop c2, we're going to be threatening things like h6 and h7. Notice no bishop a5, because that would just lead to a completely drawn opposite color bishop's position. Right? What am I saying? That would be trading. We'd be trading, but it would be similar in the sense that the knight is controlling the dark squares against the bishop on d1, and we'd rather get rid of our light square bishop with bishop takes a4, which, you look at it, it's hard to get out of this. So king b5, let's call that an exclam move. Bishop d1 exclam, and king c6, definitely an exclam move. Blunder, I guess, but boom, now it's over. It ended remarkably quickly. So, John ends up showing his class at the end, and to me, a remarkable game. I actually feel like I've had a lot of games that are very similar to this, and some of them I didn't win, some of them I lost too, where really, like, when you think about John's mistakes, they were kind of hard to see even, like, and that a3 move that he did, well, I wasn't even necessarily a mistake. That was a practical decision to gambit the pawn, and it actually worked out, So let's say he had a moment of complacency, and that's what got him into into the situation. And I've been there, and the moves that Cam did kind of lulled him into that. I'm going to say king f8, h6, b6. John, I'm just hanging out. I'm not doing anything. I'm your friend, And so it's funny, like what John was saying about the sense of urgency that black needed to see, it was kind of rebounded on him because he disrespected his opponent for not sensing that lack of urgency, and then himself pushed a little bit too hard when he needed to consolidate, I feel, with moves like rook c2. Okay, so we're going to look at another game with the two bishops now. This is Philippe. I think he's also known as Cat of Seven Tails, not Nine Tails, but I'm not going to ask. Here we go. In this game, Philippe falls for a standard trick that's going to allow his opponent a great double bishop ending. Now, the first thing, though, we need to say, Philippe doesn't comment on this. He says f3, the moves still are typical of the line, except I have my knight on e2 instead of my bishop. And I'm not some expert in this kind of thing, but knight g3 makes a lot of sense to me, where the knight controls this and makes black wonder about h4, h5, to me with a very promising position for white. Yeah, very promising. So this seems to be the first mistake. And as they say, mistakes come in pairs, so we're about to get another. h6, and this is a tactical trick that King's Indian players know. It's just a good one to know about. It's very easy to fall into. So white falls for it. Bam. Check to the miserable. First knight takes. Check to the miserable king. And snip. Knight c3. Snip. Now, arguably, black doesn't have to trade, right? But let's just leave it there. And let's read what Philippe writes. I have a worse position, but I don't think it's lost or anything. All right, I'm going to pause. I'm going to read some comments. Why don't you guys just think about it? How bad is it for white? All right. So, yeah, it's an interesting question to me. Let's say that the advantage for white, the thing he's got going for himself, is maybe his king is much better, as in the last example. But his bishop is horrendous. Like in the last example, the pawns, white's pawns are on light squares, meaning that the dark square bishop is his best friend, and it's now gone. So my intuition here is that black should be, it's hard to say winning, but he should be doing great. He should be doing absolutely fantastic. And we're going to see, though, that things go downhill pretty quickly for black. And this is an example of a position, maybe it takes a little bit of experience to play. And one of the things about it is black should understand what his trumps are, and I feel the next couple moves he doesn't really get it. He kind of flails around a little bit and loses a lot of his advantage. There's many moves that black could play. Bishop d7, c6. I kind of like f5 best. So after f5, if you want, you can meet knight b5 with rook f7. You're not worried about that too much. And what do you want? You want to open the position. You want to open the f-file at some point too. And right, we're going to give black the business. White the business. All right, things turn around in kind of a miraculous way because black doesn't appreciate it. Bishop h6, it's just nice looking. It doesn't do anything. h4, good. Good. And what this is going to do is, at the very least, it's going to crack the f5 square. And so every Russian schoolboy knows you want to take back with the pawn, but now in this position, there's no more taking back with the pawn. fe4, not what black wants to do, because now the knight on c3, which wasn't the greatest friend ever, gets a fantastic square on e4. Now, clearly, black said to himself, oh, I really like this bishop, but, you know, what are you going to do next? Are you ever going to take that knight? White is the master of the light squares, right? He's essentially up a piece on the light squares. So the idea that we're going to be messing with this knight, it's not really going to pan out. Bishop h5, rook f6. And I really like the next move. I have no idea if it's technically correct or anything, but I think it's great from a positional standpoint. You sack it. So now you own the light squares, and you're up the pawn on g6. I kind of like it. And notice now that your knight is unmolested on e4, you really have a lot of things going for you. Now, are you better? I wouldn't press that point, but you have a very interesting and nice position. c5 takes, and yeah, with c5 we're giving him a little drama, and the problem for black now too is like, well, what does he do? what is he supposed to do? Okay, so things go well now. Bishop e2. We're going to do some sacrifices, and now the game's over, I feel, right? And Philippe also writes it's pretty simple now. So I thought that was a great, there's many great notes in there, and a very interesting two-bishop position where, yeah, I have a worse position, but I don't think it's lost or anything. Interesting. I know that myself and other people, I think King's Indian players especially, would salivate. would salivate at this. Whether it's lost, I don't know, but it's definitely one of those ones where black's going to say to himself, I'm going to work this guy. I'm going to work this guy really hard. Okay, so let's go on to the next game. Okay, like I said, I've got different themes for this show. And so we've started off with the two bishop in the endgame. And now we're going to do 3 games with Dreams of Federico the F-pawn. And in 2 of the games, we're going to see that there's weakness, there's a critical weakness with F4. And in one game, I think White needed the weakness of F4, and I'm going to get to that in a little bit. Actually, I'm going to start with this game with Nicholas, and I'm going to come back to Marty. So, Nicholas has been playing this Slav stuff, totally fine. And Nicholas likes E4. It's definitely like the most common move in the database. I'm not really a complete friend of E4. It's totally a move, of course. I guess B3 is a nice move too, just holding the tension. But E4, snip. You could take DC and play E5 as well. Snip. And now a move that I don't like, H6. So let me share something that comes up in another game as well later, and that is that when Black talks about this move, Nicholas is talking about, I was worried about bishop h7, and that kind of thing, maybe worried about bishop g5. He talks about weakening the king side. That's all true. It's all true. But the critical problem with h6 is the loss of time. That's the critical problem. And we're going to see that again and again, and that's the issue here for a lot of players, is the loss of time. And if there's anything, I'll look at anybody's game, but if you lose a tempo on my show, I want to tell you that hurts me more than anything. If you have a tactical error, I don't care. If you have a positional understanding, I don't care. But if you lose a tempo on this show, I just want to say it's not the end of the world, but it hurts me. If you want to hurt me, then lose the tempo. All right. So many other moves. Queen c7 comes to mind. Knight f6 comes to mind. c5 is what Nicholas wrote. Okay. Now, White doesn't necessarily take advantage of this whole business here either. And bishop e3 seems suspect to me. Especially because at some point, Black might decide to play f5, f4. Knight f6, and we kind of bounce around a little bit. I don't like rook e8. Really, we're wasting more time. Of course, you should play bishop b7. And now knight e5. And here's the funny thing about the White position. And I've been here before as White. You got this position, and maybe you were threatening to take on h6. I'm a little skeptical, but maybe you were, right? And that was why rook e8 happened. Actually, let's go through the notes that Nicholas wrote. So this was his terror. And now we're saying it's all over. Interesting. That might be true. That might be true. With knight g5, and that's it. Do I give him a pass on rook e8? It just feels like, oh, I don't want to give him a pass. Here's a simple move, Nicholas. Before you lose a tempo, why don't you just play that, Okay. So, anyways, rook e8. The advantage of rook e8 is it makes White lose his mind a little bit. And knight e5 is an interesting move because it's going to really commit White to playing f4. And one of the things, I'm going to talk about this f4 in a couple of different positions. One of the things about this f4 is it's going to dramatically weaken the White king, and it's going to dramatically weaken the e4 square. Notice, too, a problem that White has is, like, what is this bishop actually doing? And is it loose? Like, later, is it going to be the subject of a tactical problems, like I'm just sitting in the way of stuff? And of course, when they play bishop c2, the dream is to do some kind of queen d3 thing. So I don't think knight e5 itself was bad, but we're going to see that It's going to get complicated. So, bishop b7, f4. Okay. It weakens a lot of squares. Absolutely. Nicholas writes f3. That definitely would be better, but it's pretty weird to put your knight on e5 and then play e3, f3, right? So, f4. And here I thought black's, just playing natural moves, and it's white who's building himself a hole. That white had an interesting opportunity here that I don't even know if it's any good, but it would have been interesting. There's a lot of old-time GM games where black is about to play c5. Once he plays c5, his position is totally open and free. So the interesting move, I think, for white is to say, well, what about that? Now, a lot of times in these positions, it's the c5 pawn you're gambiting. But I thought this was an interesting gambit because if you want to take this thing, you're going to give me your dark square bishop. And do I know what's happening in this position? Absolutely not. But I think it's at least dangerous for black because the bishop on b7 is now dead. And, we've got the f-file. We've got the bishops. It feels like compensation to me. Okay. So, in the game, white played h3. Well, at least you're not doing it, Nicholas. He's doing it. He plays h3. And what you can feel with white here is that he's lost his mind. And he doesn't know what to do. Okay, rook a d8. Now later, Nicholas is angry at himself because he wants the e-rook on d8. But honestly, it feels okay to me. Queen e2, another move. He's lost his mind. He doesn't know. He's put his knight on e5 and then doesn't have an idea of what to do next. And I think that's why I mentioned the c5 idea, because that at least is a powerful idea where white's doing something. And the worst thing you can do, once you've committed to this very dynamic knight on e5, which has weaknesses for white, is you waste some time. And you kind of just sit and you don't do anything. And black, of course, it's not hard to find rook a d8. c5 would have been fine too. c5, rook a d8. And now, it's kind of interesting here. A lot of times, when people make an evaluation, I don't know if it's a computer evaluation or it's just theirs. But my sense here was that Nicholas felt like maybe it was kind of an equalish position. And I just can't agree. I feel like this is a classic situation where white has made a key weakness. He has less pawns in front of his king, and one of those pawns is even way up on f4. And this bishop, amazing. This bishop not knowing what it's doing. Kind of hitting at air. And, I think in a lot of players' intuitions, they see the bishop on c2 and say, well, I've got the initiative, I'm attacking there. But if you don't have the initiative, as white doesn't here, well, no, it's doing nothing. So I think Nicholas gave a variation with c takes here, bishop takes, and then rook c8, which I don't get, and leading to equality. And I just want to put for myself, bishop c5 looks fantastic, looks fantastic. Long term, we are just going, well, I don't know. I don't know how white survives this long term because the king is a disaster. And the bishop on b7, monster. Okay. One thing I guess I wanted to do this with the weaknesses is I had a formative game years ago. I was trying to become a GM and maybe a mildly similar position. And I was white against Julio Becerra, who's a great GM, lives in Miami now. He lived in Miami forever. I think now he's got a family, doesn't play as much anymore. Anyways, I played some move like f4, partly out of frustration. As in the sense of I don't know what to do in the position. I'm going to play f4. And after the game, you rightly said, Yeah, well, now the game's shifted. Now the game's shifted. Now I've got like some really dark long-term things to do against you after this f4 is committed. And if you're going to do f4, you need to follow it up with activity and not just sit around like this guy's doing. And rook c8, don't just take on d4 and play bishop c5. You're doing great. White's just sitting around. Knight e4. Well, you take on d4 or put the other rook on d8, right? I don't really understand White's play. They kind of go around, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to highlight this game. Horrendo move. You can't play chess like that. And you can kind of get inside his mind too. He's like, oh no, the black queen's gonna get here. Well, now, my friend, we got a holy moly on our hands, right? Okay, now he gives us complete control of the light squares, and I'm going to call this one lost. All right. Nice finish here from Nicholas. Trade off the bishop finally. We own the airwaves. Check the miserable king, and this is what you get when you weaken your position. Okay, let's go to Marty. Marty in SF. And I believe this appealed to my sense of weakness as well. By the way, in this position, there is a very similar. There's a game. I always get the name of the round mixed up, but in the Talbot Vinnick match, I'm gonna say it's game 9, but I get it wrong a lot. Anyways, where Tal, just to kind of mix things up, played without d4, knight f3, g3, and played b3, and then knight e4 came, and then d4. So we would transpose to this position, to that game, I think, if it went like b3, as in this game, knight e4, that would transpose. And one thing that I've asked students here, actually, several times, I've used it as a training game, is what should black do in this position? And, they say all kinds of things. Bishop e6, bishop f5, knight d7, f5, also an interesting move. And the move that I like here for black, I think is very instructive, is to play a5. And the cool point of it is that these guys, they don't really know what they're doing yet. And they can remain uncommitted if we get our rook on a8 in, right? The only reasons for especially the bishop on c8 needs to move is because of the rook. So now we're just going to ask White a question. If we get a4 in, we're going to say that our rook is developed. It's that simple, right? Okay, so in all that time, one of the reasons I wanted to bring that up, in all that time, no one ever said rook e8. Maybe they did, but I forgot it. I forgot about it. And one of the reasons that's kind of interesting about this game as a mistake that black now does is black is under the impression when he plays this move and rook e8 that pawns are people. I've said it a lot of times on the show. Pawns are not people. And what I mean by that is a lot of times players are confused, and I stress this because I was confused as a kid, that they think pawns are people. And what that means to them is they have an idea of like, oh, there's some kind of pawn break I need to do. So they organize all their energy behind this pawn break without thinking about the rest of their dudes. And the bishop's crying. The knight is just dying. He's dying inside. And this rook is he's just so sad. What you've done to him. So that's when you sense that as white, I think then you don't make the mistake that Marty does here, right? Because you need to sense that black has done some terrible crimes. And what Marty does, he still gets a better position. It's hard not to get a better position. But he takes, and he doesn't explain too much about why he did it this way. My guess is that he was afraid that on knight c3 there was going to be some kind of e5. In fact, he does give some notes, but doesn't, just use any words. And the simple truth about this is you don't need to worry about any kind of e5 stuff, because if Black's so ill-developed as he is here, he does not want to open the windows and doors to the house. The house is messy. It's not ready for visitors. He needs to clean it up before he opens it. And so if he wants to open it for us, we just have to say, okay, we'll calculate it when it comes, but we are not worried about e5 in any way, because the value of time goes up when the position opens, and Black is really down in time. Okay, so the problem with this is now we're giving the knight a beautiful square on c6. At c3, e6. It's not hard for you guys to guess what I want. I want him to play e4 right now. Why? Because we need to open the position before dude gets his pieces in. Now, rook c1 wasn't terrible. And Marty then loses the way with knight b5. And I think one of the things about chess is you want to have these abstract ideas in your head. They will help you find the correct moves. And knight b5, right, isn't addressing the problems in the position which really need to be opened. And the knight on c6 is just blocking our rook on c1, right? Okay. Notice, too, that later in the game, Marty will find himself in a position where he's going to say to himself, you know, I don't know what else to do, so then I'll play e4. A lot of times that happens, I find, like players are forced to end up making the right decision later just because that's the only thing they're left with, right? Okay. So, this is the ugly portion of the game, and finally, e4 happened. Knight c4. We're going to bounce around a little bit. And now f4. Here we go. All right. So, Black, in the meantime, has done some really controversial things. One of them is putting the queen on c7. The next is really like he's obviously overlooking, both players did, that this move was a good move. And I guess all you need to calculate is here, 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 and then here. But I want to stress something about this f4 move, and it's very similar, or some similarities anyway, to Nicholas's game. That you're creating a long-term problem with f4. And the bishop on h6, not the most impressive dude. In fact, it's interesting, I mentioned the Tall game. So the Tall Botvinnik match, 1960, one of the greatest books ever written. And there is a variation there with bishop h6 and some sacrifices. And the bishop h6 just doesn't belong on h6. And one of the things we should see is we're not really afraid of him taking on e3, especially not here with either the knight or the bishop, because those are his best pieces. The knight on d5 needs to control f6, and the bishop, no way you want to get rid of that guy. So even if knight d5, what I'm trying to say is, even if knight d5 weren't possible, you still don't want to play Federico. And especially here, Federico isn't going to make all that much sense. Okay, bishop g7. Do I understand the Black's moves? Not entirely. Okay. Things get a little weird here. I wanted Black to play bishop e8 in a lot of these positions. Now, it's starting to get funky for Marty here, especially with those weaknesses. And here we go. It's very similar to the game with Nicholas, where it's going to be who gets there first, and the Black pieces look pretty dangerous. Right? Very dangerous. Pow! And it's all over. So, right, very similar games, and the theme is the weakness of the f4 pawn. Now, it doesn't mean that Frederico's always bad. I'm not trying to say that. And in fact, the next game I'm going to show is going to talk a little bit about when we should start thinking about Frederico. This will be a long show, mini submissions. Yeah, Vishnu, I've got you up. You're number 8, buddy. You're number 8. You can, everybody, you know, we keep this thing on the Twitch will have it for a while, so you can watch the replay if you miss it or miss part of it. And we haven't figured out what we're going to do with the YouTube. And it feels like too long to put it on YouTube, but I'm going to try to put in the good parts of the show onto YouTube. Okay, so now let's move on to Juan's game, and let's flip it because he was black. And here we go. All right, a6, kind of an interesting move. It's going to, let's just say, multi-purpose move. It's not nearly as bad as it looks. Some people might revolt when they see a6. But we'll see that as a variety of good points. The first is that white has to worry about the DCs and b5s of the world, and then bishop b7. And if white takes, which I believe he should, then black is going to say it might end up being useful, especially if white wants to go for a minority attack, because the pawn is already here, and we're going to put the pawn on c6 anyway. So we got like a block, a prepared block on the b5 square. So that's kind of the dark truth of this a6 move. All right, now, is white better? Yeah, he's a little bit better. And here's an interesting thing that I'm going to blow through a couple of these moves and talk about the position starting here. Very typical Carlsbad structure. We've had a lot of games like this on the show. Is there a list of which games are being looked at today? No, there's a list on my clipboard here but you know, my process is there's a lot of games are submitted, and I'm really trying to look at all of them. There are a lot of games to look at, and so maybe there's some way that I can give the information out. But basically, I try to organize it before the show and think about it in the weeks ahead. And by the way, I want to stress, there were several games here which are actually annotated. I just felt like I wouldn't be able to do them. It's not just both time-wise and in terms of my mental ability to keep them all in my head. Okay, so let me come back to this game. I will try to come up with some way of giving a list. All right. In this game, white is now going to kind of fart around and go for the minority attack. And one of the great things that Juan writes in a future note is he says, I know you don't like the minority attack, but it's probably his best plan now that his pieces are not fighting for e4. It's hilarious that Juan knows me so well. And one of the reasons that I don't necessarily like it is I feel like it's the people who do it are playing with pawns instead of pieces, right? Because the dream of the minority attack is to do this, smack this, maybe you take here, and maybe you can say that you've got a weakness on c6, taking forever and often not paying attention to the pieces. In the meantime, black will at some point put a knight on e4, and even with reduced material, he will strive anyway to get an initiative against the white king. In a lot of ways, it's unfair that he sometimes gets initiative onto the white king because white has more pawns in front. So this was a position I was thinking about what white should do. Let me say I believe in white's position because a6, it's nice, but if you don't do the minority attack, it's not that special. And we did get the exchange of the dark square bishops. I'm not saying white's a lot better or anything, nothing like that. But I do think white should be able to find a path to some kind of version of him being better. And I'm not at all sure of this next move, but I think that what white needs to understand in these positions is that he's got an extra central pawn, and he should be at least dreaming about using it. And the move that at least attracts my attention is knight e5, knight bd7, and f4. Now, I want to stress it's still a very complicated struggle ahead for both sides, but the idea is I want to squeeze him. I want to squeeze him a little bit, and I want to use the f pawn in this way. This is obviously double-edged, and white's going to have to follow this up energetically if it's going to work out at all. This is usually called the Pillsbury attack. Usually, Pillsbury attack you could say is a particular variation of the Queen's Gambit decline, but in my head it's also just this idea where you're using the f4 move as in the Carlsbad structure. Let me show you something else about Federico the f-pawn. Let's say black plays the conventional, let's say knight c3, knight f6, snip, snop, bishop g5, bishop e7. There's a couple move orders this could happen in. But this is like the beautiful Kasparov plan from back in the day, which is we're going to put the pawn on f3. And there, white, at first it feels like, oh, the idea of f3 is to push e4, and that's part of the idea. But the other main point is that by putting the knight on e2, you get to control e4 and dominate the knight on f6. And we've talked about this on the show before, but I wanted to stress it because when we talk about the dreams of Federico in the Carlsbad in particular, it's something where Federico needs to have his say in some way, or else I don't feel like white's going to do anything here. So what am I preaching today? When you move Federico the f-pawn, well, there needs to be, either a sense of urgency. There has to be a sense of urgency that you are making a dynamic weakness and you want to turn it into something. If you don't turn it into something, well, then you're going to meet the fates that Marty and Nicholas's opponent did in their games. All right, let's check this out. White flutters about a little bit. Gets this very standard knight e4 thing. And looks fine. Even g5 is fundamentally okay, and here white goes insane, and let's have some sympathy for the guy. What are you supposed to do? I like what Juan is doing here. He's pushing on the king side, and it's both psychologically uncomfortable and positionally uncomfortable, and especially if white doesn't have a plan. So he loses his mind. And here we go. Thank you very much. And now I guess, I don't know, we're winning or something? At least it kind of sort of felt that way to me. Yeah, beautiful position. And here he makes a mistake. Juan makes a mistake. And we did a show. It wasn't really a show. It was a vote chess game that we played against some guys in England. And one of the things that Kostya remarked on is that the knight on d6 is an amazing piece in the Carlsbad structure. It's just covering, just hitting this. Everything's hit, and you cover your only weakness with b7. And of course, white's left with the business on e3. Much better position for black. Instead, h5 seems weird. And we get this ending. I'm not sure about king e2. Okay, here we go though. fe3, rook e3. Let's read what Juan writes. I honestly thought this was winning, but later analysis with the computer showed how wrong I was. I don't know how, you're a little bit wrong. It was not unreasonable to go for this position given where you were. The guy did play passively. In fact, let's just chastise white for a second here. King f2. In this position, White should be, I think, playing things like rook d1 and rook d3, and then, dreaming of activity himself. Okay, king e2. This is really passive, isn't it? King f6. Of course, actually, I'll take it back. You're right, you're right. You could play king f5 here if you analyze it out. But is it dangerous for white? Absolutely. All right. h4, b4, and I hear you with king f3 being a dead draw. And let's just say the bummer for black is that white has more tempos to burn on the queen side. So for example, in this position, yeah, he has more tempos. There's no way that we can move around enough times on the queen side for him to move off of f3. If he moves off f3, then we're going to win. I think we get a similar thing in the game. So here we go. b4, g4. And now we're doing well. We just wait, and now we've got it. We're gonna eat everything. All right, beautiful game. And let's move on to Homsar. And this was, I'm going to do 2 games now where people came into my chateau and they lost time. So yeah, we're going to have 2 games about time here. And Homsar's black, so let's switch it up. The exchange variation of the Slav is where we're going. Bleh. Well, let me say that the exchange variation of the Slav I find to be very dynamic. I know it doesn't feel that way, but kind of like the London, and the Slav is in a lot of ways a sister opening to the London. Maybe the exchange Slav. In a lot of ways, I feel like it's an improved version of the London, because in this we often play d4, bishop f4 like in a London, except unlike the London, we don't put our pawn on c3, right? And the pawn on c3, well, no, that's where my knight wants to go. Black players, though, shouldn't feel like this is some boring mess. There's all kinds of variations here which lead to incredible violence and complications. And I've played it a lot as white, and I don't think I've ever had a boring game. It's always been a very dynamic thing where a lot of calculation is required. And yeah, a lot of very fascinating positions can arise. So, to the people who say this is a boring position, I say you lack imagination or simply haven't seen enough games. Crimes. Crimes against the chessboard, h3. Of course you should play bishop f4. And now, let's just say, this a3 move, very strange of course, is actually a thing that I've seen with reversed colors. How does it go? It goes like d4, let's say, knight f6, knight c3, knight c6, bishop f4, and then you often see a6 with the intention that if e3, then they're going to go bishop g4 and trade off the knight, and a6 will control b5 and someday aim for b5. Interesting. It's definitely one of the main variations I've faced. So it's kind of like white blew the tempo over there, and now he's going to get it. And if he were following the same idea, he would play bishop g5 here with, I don't know, an interesting position where h3 I think is basically meaningless. b4, okay. I don't know if a6 is necessary, though. I don't get it. Why a6, right? Theme of this game, tempo. I don't see any point in playing a6. b5 on white's part would be a mistake, because then we get to play knight a5. So a simple move like rook c8 or bishop e7 comes to mind. All right. Strange days over here. I don't really get rook fe8. Rook ct is finally, that's a good move. And now I think right around here we're going to get a crime here. Knight e5. And, oh man, Homsar, you're better than this, buddy. You're better than this. Knight a7. That can't be right, right? That can't be right. And watch what you say. I wanted to fight for the c file. What about fighting for your knight? What about fighting for your knight? He wanted to be a part of the fun too. Yeah. Okay. I get it. It was a little bit. The position had become a little bit frightening. I don't think you had anything too much to fear, but I get it. It became frightening because you were worried about some kind of knight takes d5 tactic. But this is even worse, right? Because the pieces aren't happy. The pieces aren't happy now. All right. Bishop h2. Why? Why would we play bishop h2? I don't know. Queen b7, okay. Maybe we could have considered this as part of our f4, but this f4 is criminal in more ways than we can imagine, right? This f4 is completely killing the bishop on h2, right? Dead. And I think I'm actually going to do a video on how to beat the London or play against it. And what I'm going to say here, and I didn't realize this the first time I went over this game, is I think what White's imagination was, is there's a variation where Black plays bishop d6, White goes bishop g3, and at a certain point he plays knight e5 and f4. It's a very strange system. Very popular, though. And I think in White's imagination he's doing something similar. But notice, the knight didn't need any help, and now with f4 he's just killed his bishop on h2. Knight d7. No! Get ready to stick this in here. But alright, knight d7, you're better too, so I'm not going to complain too much. Good move. And now, of course, you should be better, but mostly because the stupid bishop on h2. Your knight wanted you to play bc, but your knight's going to come out at some point here anyway. I don't know what White's doing. a5. Interesting. It seems like, yeah, we're going to call that interesting. I don't understand that move, and I guess he's lost now. Two passed pawns are too much. Check to the miserable king, a little weird. Should be winning. Should be winning. Still should be winning, right? Why f6, right? I don't know. So king c6. Just play king c6. Now, here's the weirdest thing. Was it a draw? It's hard to imagine, right? Maybe it's gone south enough where we do want to concede a draw, but how did it ever happen? It happened because we lost loads of time. And f6 didn't help our cause because White wants to open the position for the bishop. White's pawns are disastrous because they're doubled, and by doubled they're going to have weaknesses where the knight is going to be able to get at them. Even here you're winning, of course, and you could have played takes and knight c3 after bishop c5, for example. So the problem, Homestar. Now listen, every time we go over our games, this is whether you're a GM or an 1100 player, I think the thing to bear in mind is you're gonna make mistakes. Everybody's gonna make mistakes, but there are certain mistakes that you should lash yourself for, right? Certain mistakes you need to have forgiveness for yourself for. For example, if you go over the game with the computer and the computer shows you some weird thing that you would have never found anyway, fine, don't worry about that, right? It's the mistakes, though, like loss of time. Oh, man. Those are the kinds of ones you really want to say, man, I don't ever want to do that again because it offends my soul. Because it offends Cry's soul. And if I show up to his class again, losing the tempos, he's going to be really mad. Yeah, we're going to try to do these to the YouTube. It's a little weird when I do a really long one because I feel like in the YouTube I want to try to have some content which is polished in some way. But maybe we'll just upload the whole thing. We'll see. Okay, let's go to Kaspar from Estonia. He is a recent addition to our show. Worried about his English, but I thought his English was great. And one cool thing I like about this guy in his notes is that he's completely unaware of theory, right? And one of the things I think, when I say theory, I mean opening theory. And that can be an advantage. As long as you have the principles of opening play, I think you can actually be more dangerous on the chessboard than if you know a lot of stuff. A lot of times knowing a lot of stuff just makes things weirder. Okay, so we're going to see where Kaspar from Estonia needs to be lashed, and the theme of this one is going to be tempo. One of my favorite annotations actually of all time is he's writing the end of my theoretical knowledge at the time of this game, and then after knight f3, developing the knight to the ideal square. Absolutely. You don't need to know mounds of theory to do this stuff. You just need to make normal developing moves. So now, here's one of the important points, Gaspar. Imagine you're playing this position and you're not thinking about deep thoughts. You're just saying to yourself, well, what should I do? Well, I think you're going to play bishop d3, right? Maybe you play bishop d2. That's also probably totally fine. And you're going to have a rich positional game either way. Black is going to do his own business, and you're going to react to it. Fine. But watch this annotation, and let's read it. I think there'll be some things to be clear that are wrong in the thinking that everybody should pay attention to. And I know that I made this similar kind of mistaken reasoning. So let's read it. G3, challenging the long diagonal. After the moves, bishop b7, bishop d2 castles, my light square bishop will be protected, whereas the enemy one will be hanging. This creates potential for tactics with the f3 knight. On the other hand, maybe this was an unnecessary loss of time. Right? All that other stuff you said is completely secondary to time. And a lot of times people will tell me G3 and they'll say stuff like you're kind of hinting at here where I'm going to have some light square weaknesses. So, screw the light square weaknesses. You just lost time. That's a whole, time is an important beast. And, right. When you think about this position too, that bishop d3 needs to happen. Castles. If you wanted to play g3, fine. You can play g3, but you do it here or after knight f3. Fine. It's got to be rational. And all this seems, anytime you play a reasonable developing move that you don't need to be a genius to play, that will be the move that has some name attached to it, right? Like this was called normal line. Well, I never knew it to be called the normal line, but that's what chess.com calls it, right? This was, for example, right? For example, this is 1950s. You look at the Botvinnik games and all those guys. This is how they played against the Nimzo-Indian. Okay, so here we go. Lots of time. I did my rant. C5, D5. Beautiful move. Beautiful move. Absolutely correct. And what you are doing here is you are crushing this bishop on B7. Okay. Terrible move. He needs at some level to realize that he needs to fight for the D5 square. Now his bishop is toast. 91. Let's read this. 91 is a mistake according to Stockfish. On the other hand, 91 is at least a sensible looking move. And you do want to aim to play f4, and that's what you end up doing. What the computer sees, and this is important, I feel like maybe you didn't get it, is the computer wants you to have the option of recapturing on c3 with the queen, so that you have no weaknesses and yada yada. Also with queen c2, you'd be threatening maybe knight e4 to hang the bishop on b4 out to dry. But in principle, knight e1 is a pretty deep move, right? Okay, because you need to play f4 to gain some space. Now, bishop c8, as you write, bishop a6 would have been pretty annoying, but it is true that the bishop needed to relocate, and he's really got now a King's Indian structure, and he's got the beautiful bishop along with it. So we have a dynamic game. Now here you needed to play f4, because here white could shut down your dreams of f4 with the move e4, after which he would have a great position. And you write e4 and -2 on account of the engine, but I do not understand. Well, let's get into it. It's because now your bishop's dead, and what he'll do is he'll overprotect this square with moves like rook e8 and bishop f5, and then plant a knight on e5. And you can play f3, and maybe you should, but then you're going to have weaknesses like the backward pawn on e3, and of course that knight coming to e5 is going to be a big deal, and we're going to see that in the game too. So f4, knight bd7. It was a big mistake to allow you on this position to to get in f4. Now I think you're fine again, but here you make an instructive mistake, and you take. And what we're going to get now is we're going to get the same structure that we would have gotten, say, here if you had played f3. And it's terrible because of the pawn and because the knight getting the square on e5. So if, on the other hand, you had played knight f2, well, then I think you have a really, and actually you put this in your notes, you have a very difficult position for black to deal with. And in fact, you wrote, and let's just say it's because you're threatening things like g4, you wrote ef and ef, and also gf would have been maybe a move too, but the point is now he has to worry about stuff, but I mean black, has to worry about stuff like g4, and this knight is toast, in contrast to the game, and we got dreams of moving Federico up so that our bishop attains freedom, right? Okay, so here we go. Now we do this, and the reason why this is never going to work is because his knight is coming to e5, right? By the way, actually, instructive mistake. He shouldn't have no reason to take that pawn. The bishop on f1 is terrible, and so the natural human move has got to be knight e5. Just stick it there. We'll take the pawn at our leisure. He's got to worry. This knight is a monster. So the fact that it is a monster means that white will never have enough compensation. And what does he have? He's got a beautiful bishop. He does have that. Okay, so this is going to probably still be winning for black, but it's unleashing this bishop all of a sudden, which at the very least is making me nervous. Why is it a mistake? Because that's the square for our knight. That looks weird, right? If you were going to give me a rook, take my good bishop, my f4 one. Things have gone dramatically south. End of game. The knight's falling. Okay, Kaspar, I hope you come again. So, one thing that's really interesting about your notes and your game is you did have some very deep concepts. And if you can marry that with, some sense of time, well, then you're already a much more dangerous opponent. Okay. This next game is an interesting one. Vishnu has been on the show many times, and in this game he's playing Say Chess, who is on Twitter a lot, as Vishnu is, and they had a match, a correspondence match, which means I think they had like 3 days to make a move. A correspondence match in the London. And this is one of the games of that match. And so, it's a little, I don't think I've ever done commentary on a correspondence game. And so I'm going to, especially in the opening, I'm going to bypass most of the questions and just talk about a couple key positions that I just had an intuitive reaction to. Because I'm sure both players spend a lot of time doing analysis on this game. One thing that these London people are doing is they're violating a basic rule of they're playing bishops before knights. My mama said knights before bishops, and I think after c5, I don't see any troubles for black. we're at, and this, by the way, this C5 thing is Vishnu's new toy against against the London players, and I think Sam Shanklin did a video on it. There's a variety of ways to play against the London, and all I have on the opening that might be worthwhile is on knight f3, c5. c3 at least asks some important questions to black. We are threatening dc followed by b4, so you can choose to play e6 to lock your bishop in, or you can gambit a pawn and let me play dc, or you go takes, and now we have our old friend, the exchange Slav, who's the sister position of the London. Okay, as I said, I don't want to spend too much time on the opening. These guys were thinking long thoughts. Black is okay. c4 is a little controversial, but black was okay coming out of the opening. Now, b5. A little bit of a madman's move, right? Normal people would play something like knight f6. And so let's talk about this b5 a second. Maybe, it might be some kind of theoretical thing from the Shanklin video or something. The idea, if we want to be charitable to it, is to get an initiative against the queen side, and you can imagine maybe BC, bishop a3, and some kind of nastiness with bishop b2, for example. And maybe that's what's motivating White's next move, which I find a little bit strange. a4, which, right, I don't get, and the only advantage of forcing b4, which I thought was White's intention, is to take away that a3 square. Now, clearly, we're going to see White had more ideas than that, but that's the only main advantage I saw from it. Two sensible plans that White could have done. You could play knight h4. You could play bishop e2. Both those seem reasonable to me. Let's look what happened. Clearly some crazy tactics going on, and very interesting position now develops. And let's pause here for a moment. All normal moves so far. Vishnu, that was the furthest from normal I've ever seen in my life. If that's normal, I'm in big trouble, because then I'm not normal. Okay. Vishnu writes, I was happy with the bishop pair. The double pawns didn't bother me too much. I thought the space I had in the bishop pair compensated for the structure. Now, the last part about it, I think I agree. And it gets really interesting real fast. Let's presume that castles can't be wrong. And, well, black now has to prove something, because he's down in time and his king is loose. Now, Vishnu's intuition here is definitely different than mine. His intuition is to play the maddening h5 and go for it somehow on the king side in a way that's, h5 is it's not clear yet that that's the move we need to do. But already in his mind with h5, Vishnu's clearly aiming for some kind of business with castles long, right? Castles long seems insane to me, though. It felt way too loose, and I don't. These guys, when they do this correspondence thing, I don't know what it means in terms of whether I assume they're not using engines or anything, but I assume they're thinking about it pretty long. And I just want to say, from my perspective, the king wants to be on g7, and yes, you have compensation because of the bishops. Now, you have to be a little careful, I think, because if, say, king f8 now, then you're going to have to worry about this, like, tricks, like knight c4 is potentially on the table. Even here, he's not really, if you move the rook, you can meet bishop d5 with bishop h2. But in any case, those are some of the things why maybe you wouldn't want to do it. But to me, it seems insane to castle long. And Vishnu doesn't write anything about it. So, he concluded that rook g8 was insane. And let's go through that variation here, because this is an interesting, this is one of the few positions in this game I thought was kind of like instructive or interesting. And maybe I'm just wrong. It's just my opinion. So the drama with rook g8 is then if you play king f8, well, then it's not clear that this bishop wants to move yet, and it's not clear that the king wants to go to g7 because the rook's in the way. And I think if black wants to claim that he's better here, there needs to be more of a long-term sensibility of what he said, which was the bishops are better. So like king f8, maybe the rook goes to b8. You could put the rook on b8 or d8 now too. But I think that, yeah, I think the advantage is long-term. I want to stress that rather than right away. Because black needs to first catch up in development. So h5 seems controversial. Very controversial. And white in here loses the thread. But I definitely feel that white is better here. And, well, you know, let's say bishop f3 isn't wrong. He has other moves, honestly. But let's say that isn't wrong. Bishop c7. And the simple moves, I guess, here are like knight f1. You could have done this before, too, and then play b3 next and start the party. And is black going to survive? I kind of doubt it. And like I said, you could, if you wanted to, you could play knight f1 first. And that might even be better because b3 is still coming. And, well, I just don't believe... How are we getting at that white king soon enough? It's hard to see. And as is famously said, with a knight on f1, you're not going to get mated, right? Yeah, looks terrible. Looks absolutely terrible after a b3 is coming. Okay, so bishop f3, and then that seemed really weird. C takes b4. Queen d6. Knight f1. And let's read what Vishnu writes. At this point, I felt I no longer had a good position. So one thing that's interesting is clearly Vishnu felt before that his position was fantastic. When, I don't know, especially after castles long, I felt before it was, I don't know, dynamically equal or something like that. And after castles long, I'm like, I don't know, buddy. I don't know. So anyway, we all have prejudices and they carry over, and then you try to justify your position, right? So I have no attack to speak of and a loose structure. And if white manages to bring out his rook in heavy pieces, my king is vulnerable. Amen. Right? And I don't actually know where I went wrong so far. However, this suggests to me that the whole plan of castles was misguided. Yeah. Now, and you should have gone castles short on move 16. That's probably even better than my weird king f8 move. But yeah, it's a similar thing, honestly. So, correct. Now, things still are very weird. Bishop d3. The part that I don't get is, no, maybe I do get it. I don't know. But anyways, part of me just wants to take the b4 pawn. I don't know. It's going to get funky, and white really loses his mind here. He should just play bishop e2, as Vishnu notes. And this was kind of stunning to me that white allowed this. And now, intuitively, I'm going to say it has to be lost, because we've got bishops of opposite color, and the main feature of the bishops of opposite color, right, as I've said on this show 1,000 times, is that the person with the initiative has the extreme advantage because they are up a piece on the dark squares, right? And very difficult for white to for this to work out. And like king e2, that's already clearly a sign that things has gone wrong. and a bad piece of news for white. Maybe this was, I was going to say maybe g3 was his intention, but even then, even if we don't have bishop takes g3, there's like h4 and other nastiness. So this seems totally lost. Check to the miserable king. And I don't know, this has got to be lost. I'm gonna guess h5, h4, h. Well, don't quote me on that one. Actually, you could still do it because there's no on h4. There's no rook e1 because then we got to check on e8. As the way Vishnu does, it's probably okay. Yeah, but okay. Things go around. They dance around. It's a huge practical advantage for black, but things have gotten messier than our friend Vishnu would have liked. c5 felt completely wrong. Right, it feels with the move c5 that white feels that he's got loads of time in the position. And of course, if he had a lot of time, then c5 would be like this great thing where you're building it up. But I think Vishnu's right. It's a little bit too much, and there's going to have to be some other attempt to open the position and to really get the rook involved. Okay, let's check it out. Beautiful chess. It's all over. It's all over. Okay, great. So, I hope that was helpful. I feel like in that game, I was mostly concentrating on one position that I felt I kind of sort of understood. I wasn't sure I understood a lot of the rest of it, though. Okay, let's move on. This is Garrett. This has a spicy move in here. Let's flip the board for him. All right, castles is definitely the same move. Right. Vishnu, I'm glad you were here. I thought for a second you would be watching this. You'd be watching this on the replay. Here we go. By the way, c6 is a strange move, and I don't believe in the London, but if there was ever a time to transfer to the London, it's now, right, with bishop f4. Because the only point of c6 is preparing for c4, right? That's the only reason you do that to yourself. That's my 2 cents there. So now we're going to transpose to more normalish stuff. And this variation has been popular since I was a kid. And many of you might have seen the game of Ding Liren against Fabi, was also this variation. And this is some interesting stuff. Let's start here. I don't know that much about this position or anything, but I felt here that white should be better because the bishop on g6 is poor. I talked about some games that was the theme of space last month, and I put together a little video on YouTube that's called Space. You can watch that on our YouTube channel, where I talked about that game, this same variation, some similarities to this thing, and yeah, it's a very interesting position where black does have to play energetically to get something out of it. And let's say the obvious is that the only reason that black can dream of survival here is because the knight on c3 is terrible. Now, like a lot of positions that we've seen today, the bishop on e3 is white's main dude, right? So let's look at how it goes. e5. Garrett's playing International Master, and even though I don't like his next move, he proves his worth. He proves his worth later in the game. Okay. So this is an interesting moment. I haven't turned on any engines or anything here, but my guess is, well, just my intuition is that d5 feels very wrong to me. Right, because black wants to play bishop c5 anyway. And so my sense, and I don't know, was just that white's chance would have been de, and then we're going to get a whole interesting position, and I assume that black's intention was bishop c5 here, and interesting position develops. I think black is probably fine, but I just feel like that's what white should have done. And after d5, I definitely feel that the natural bishop c5 is what black should do. Now Garrett gives that a exclam, but to me that's that's just the move. You want to get rid of that beast on e3, and you're going to do it with development. Let's look at the variation. I assume this is what he's afraid of. Now notice one key thing of, let's call it chess wisdom here, is that under no circumstances should you be telling yourself that the pawn on c6 is weak. No, that pawn is genius. It's blocking the knight on c3 in a magnificent way. Queen d6. And in general, I think my only words of advice to Garrett is, if you see this position in your mind's eye, just don't worry about it, because your development is so awesome here. And the variation you gave was good, rook d8, and yeah, your pieces are so active here, and you write here that black has good compensation. I'd much rather be black here, much rather. And it's hard for me to actually imagine that it's only like compensation for the pawn. It feels like more than that to me. Maybe black could have improved. Anyways, right, there's only one move that Garrett needs to whip himself for, and that's queen b4. And it's not Stockfish saying it's an accuracy, it's me saying you're losing time. Okay, so now check this out. Snip, castles, rook d8. Bam! Oh, lordy. Oh, lordy. Oh, what a great move. I think it's a great move. Let me say a little bit more than what Garrett says. To me, it's so nice because what it's going to do is, black just needs a couple moves, and then he will have enough time to get his pieces organized. And at some point, right, he needs time to move this, castle, play f6, rehabilitate this person, right? And white, on the other hand, needs a good place for his bishop on f1. It's not immediately clear where it should go. The knight also needs some drama. Okay, so check it out. Bam! Bam! Oh, man. And, right, Garrett talks about bishop c5, and well, let's go into that variation. And we have some chances of survival, but one of the main problems here is that the white knight is about getting ready to do something, right? So if you play f5 or castles, we're going to play knight takes b5, and that's one of the hidden points of bishop b5, was that suddenly this knight, which is in the Slav, usually like white's problem piece, gets to be alive. In fact, he gave this variation. Bam. Very nice. Okay. So. All right. Yeah, beautiful. Beautiful. I think that's Kostya writing in on the ChessDojoLive account, which is cool. Glad to have him here. So, let's see how it happened. Queen e7. And, of course, your position's bad. And you're right to be critical of this, even though the guy played a brilliant move, because now it's starting to look like Morphy versus the Evil Duke, where, your king is slammed up against the sweaty thighs of your friends on bishop f8 and the rook on h8, just like that game, right? And the knight gets to live, and I guess we're going to say this is probably toast. Check. Can't move the knight, unfortunately. You can't castle, and you can't really move the knight. So you give it up, and I guess the game's over. We'll run through this here. Beautiful play. Really like the way this guy played this game. Man, just evil. Taking all of Garrett's stuff. Man. There are probably easier ways of doing it, but there it is. Okay, yeah, really beautiful move. And, one thing is, if you submit a game here where, you got nailed and you want to talk about it, that is probably the best use of your time. And so, and beautiful, also beautiful for sharing somebody else's brilliancy there. And notice, when you think about beating an IM like this, in this, when the position's so volatile, like it was over here, it's really just one move. A lot of times, let's say the game we started with, right, with Cam's game against John Donaldson, there's going to be a lot of mistakes on both sides, inaccuracies, let's call them. When the position is violent, right, once we get this, say, D5, or this position here, with this kind of violence, it's going to be maybe one mistake, right? And especially against somebody who's dangerous and capable of finding a move like Bishop B5, there we go. There we go, yeah. All right, Scott likes Bishop B5. I like it too. Let's move on to Paul in New Jersey. Paul's been on the show a number of times. Let's flip it so we can see from his perspective. And this was there's a virtue here that Kostya actually taught me and David something on, in a very similar position where we were doing one of these vote chess games. The ability to, talk to each other in the audience and they would vote on it. I want to do it again. I don't know why we haven't done it. It was kind of fun. Anyways, the point that Paul in New Jersey writes is that about delaying castling is once you castle, then the bishop g5 ideas are going to become a little bit more annoying. Plus, there's the added dream of Gary the g-pawn, which really needs to be a key part of anybody's arsenal here, where we might play rook g8 and g5 at any moment, just blasting him for that h3 move. In fact, back in the day when I was a kid, people were not thinking about pushing Gary the g-pawn. I just want to be very clear about it. This is a very new thing. And h3 is like the red flag to the matador now. And I believe if you go back, and it was Aronian, I might get this wrong, but Aronian Kramnik from the 2018 candidates is a mildly similar position, and Kramnik played rook g8 and g5 and just ripped him. A transformative game, because it was just like, no, the rules of chess have changed. They've changed after that game where you pushed Gary the g-pawn. Anyways, Kostya was saying, look, just wait, and you can play lame-o moves like a6 and bishop a7. And that probably needs to happen anyway. And then you can see what the guy does. All right, so castles, it can't be that bad though, to castle, right? Okay. A3, little weird. A6, little weird. But, we're doing it. H6, okay. It's all right. Now, Gary the g-pawn isn't as happy because your king's there, but we're going to talk about Gary in a second. So, knight e2, bishop a7. Now, let's say this. The virtue of putting the bishop on a7 is just he wants to get out of the way. He's going to get hit at some point. So it's not that bad of an idea just to move him out of the way. All right. And this is where I think Paul writes some interesting stuff. And this is the part of the game I want to focus on a little bit. He writes, here is where the lack of positional understanding kicked in. It seemed obvious to me that white wanted to play knight f5, but how big a threat is it? Should I lose sleep over it? Okay, good. And, these e4, e5 positions are really fascinating, and in contrast, actually, to the game we just looked at. Usually in the e4, e5 stuff, where you're playing the Gioco piano, the quiet game, and the Ruy Lopez, they will be structures where both sides can make inaccuracies and no one's like losing right away, at least usually. But right, you want to have a sense of what's going on. And if you lose that sense, which is a little bit what happens now, well, then things can go wrong. So a standard plan, I think there's going to be more than one, but a standard plan for black here is, yes, he wants to play knight f5. So if we play king h7, let's say knight h4, and then we can play g6. If we needed to, we could have played knight g8 as well. And one thing I want to stress about Gary the G-pawn here is even though he's not going loco with G5, he is really very much dominating the knights on G3 and H4. So, as I've stressed before, containing your opponent's pieces is in itself an aggressive act. It's not just like I'm sitting around doing nothing. I am doing something very valuable. And it is true, and I'm glad you wrote in, Paul, that that you did lose the thread here. And so the next couple moves, and this happens, everybody loses a thread. And often the whole thing why I stress when mistakes come in pairs is you're just going to lose your mind until you land, right? And then oftentimes when you land, it's already over. But let's look into it. B5, when you say you're just trying to gain space, is the move of a man who's already losing his mind a little bit, because B5 doesn't help. And in the same way that bishop A7 was useful because you're getting out of the way of any kind of hit on your bishop, well, you're helping white in the same way. In fact, later I think you played D5, and that would have been a useful tempo on the bishop on C4. Again, you can play King H7. And now Knight E7 is often not a terrible move, especially if the pawn is on C3, because we're going to say then that the knight is dominated and needs to get out of dodge, needs to do something with its life. Now, though, the knight's going to be awkward. It can't go to G6, and the queen coming to F3 is actually going to be a big deal, and now our queen no longer has tricks with like Knight E4 to expose the knight on H4. So right, things have gone wrong, and you could still try to survive here with some kind of, let's say, King H7, Queen F3, Knight G8. Now, maybe the computer would say Bishop F7. I kind of think it's not going to work with Bishop F7. Maybe it would, actually. But I'm just saying, this is our last dance. And let's just pretend Bishop F7 doesn't work. I don't know exactly what's going on. In any case, the point is that even when you make some inaccuracies like you did in this kind of position, you're still not toast. Okay. So, D5, Queen F3, Bishop B7, and this is also, even though you're missing a tactic here, the thing I want to stress is it's not just the tactic that you're missing, it's that the bishop because the bishop on B7 doesn't really have a future. It's hitting that E4 pawn. The E4 pawn is a rock right now. So you miss that, and I guess the game's over, right? Queen D4, things have gone bad. Ouch. Yeah, and there's the game. The game ends. All right, let's move on. Yeah, nice little segment of positional understanding, especially for the E4, E5 players. All right, let's look at Matt's game. Matt is white, and is astonished. This position has always fascinated me. I played this variation when I was a kid. This is very popular when I was a kid. And it took me decades to realize that I think it's the wrong idea for white. Okay. Now, Matt plays a move here that I disagree with. It kind of feels like to him it's theory, so maybe it is. I'm just going to say I disagree with it. Now, back in the day, we played a useless move, H3 here, which I think in hindsight it was not necessary. But the idea is important, is that you wanted to prevent Knight G4, E5 to trade stuff. Now, this is the important part that I feel like Matt needs to understand to play this opening. On a superficial level, what it feels like what's happened is that white has won a pawn and now has consolidated his king. In fact, black, I feel, has achieved really all of the dreams of the opening. You know, it's still, the best player is still going to win and all that. But this is, I think, a great position for the Benko player. And really, if you don't like this position, you shouldn't be playing the Benko. Because what you are doing in the Benko, let me try to put it in the simplest words I can, is you are sacrificing a pawn in a Benoni structure, okay? And the idea of this pawn sack is to give white so much drama on the queen side that he doesn't have enough time and energy to pop us in the center and or dominate our pieces. That movement in the center in the Benoni structures often leads to an attack on the king. So that's why this curious thing happens in the the Benko, where black actually wants an endgame. And it's weird. It's weird that he wants the endgame because he's down a pawn and it's a connected pass pawn. And that's what makes the Benko so dangerous, is that once you understand that, it's like, oh, right, that's a dangerous thing. That's a very dangerous thing to know, right? It's just knowledge that's like weird and anti-intuitive. So, and in this position, especially because there's simple setups with like rook a6, queen a8, which will prevent the movement of the pawns because of the king, life will become difficult. All right, so I think, to my mind, rook e1 is the best move here. And a4 might be theory, but I'm going to say I don't like it at all, because you are making weaknesses on the queen side, and that's the dream of the black player. I want this weakness, and I want this weakness. I get it. You want to play knight b5, but black duly takes the knight away from you. So we go queen b6. Many possible moves there for black. Right, knight e8, knight c7, and I like black. I like black. Now, maybe he's not technically better or anything, but I like black. And the rook on a3 is pretty terrible. Now, somebody's probably going to tell me, they're going to be like, "Cry, this is all theory. You don't understand anything about chess." Well, if that's theory, I don't want this position. That's what I'm trying to say. I had similar-ish positions when I was a kid playing against the Benko, and it took me forever to understand that this is not what you want, especially in a long-term sense, because your a-pawn isn't going anywhere anytime soon. You do have some weaknesses to worry about, and right, very difficult business. And you want to attack on the king, but you're not going to be able to attack the king if your rook's on a3, for example, and you have to like deal with the b3 pawn. That's the entire idea that black has going on. Okay. Black fudges about, and knight f6 was, as Matt noted, incorrect. You know, something like rook b8, queen b7 are the kind of things he wants to do. Rook b4, and at some point he should be dreaming about e6. He eventually does it, but he does it like forever. He does it, I don't mean forever. He does it it takes too long doing it. Okay, white gets his knight to c4, definitely a nice thing, and then does the correct thing and trades off the knight. Okay, maybe white should consider knight d2 here and say no trade. And I should have mentioned that before. If white wants to play for an advantage against the Benko, it's the same thing as the Benoni. You can't let the guy trade. You have a space advantage. It's not about the pawn. Your advantage is in space. And so that's one of the reasons this endgame is so great, is because now with just heavies on the board, black has no space problems. g4. And it's kind of fun to play g4. Let's say the charitable interpretation of g4 is that you're finally starting some drama against the black king. The weird part about it, of course, is that it's going to be hard to imagine starting drama against the black king when your rook is on a3, right? Okay, I don't understand that, but he finally puts it on b7 and then finally decides on e6. It took him a little long, but now a very dangerous position for white. Interesting. He said, Matt said, my original intuition was f4. And let's just say it's very dangerous, the whole thing. And one of the main reasons is your rook on a3 isn't doing anything. Okay. Not impressive to play queen d8. e5, and you gave it a question mark, but if you don't play a move like e5, he's going to find a way through to your king. All right. And now, interestingly, I don't know exactly what black should do here, but I don't like this move. And let's talk about it for a second. I don't like it because you are freeing that miserable rook on a3. And I'm certain you could have done other things. Maybe queen d8, maybe rook b7. The point is simple, though, is that we never want to free the rook on a3. If he wants to give us the b3 pawn and move the rook, fine, right? Fine, we can do that. But we don't want to just give it to him for free. When I say give it to him, as I mean we're liberating the rook. Here, rook takes a b3. You give 2 question marks. Seems a very natural move, and you wanted to play queen c2. And you say it gives away your advantage, and that's interesting to me because, right, of course, I don't, I'm not sure you have an advantage here. I don't know who's better, especially with that rook on a3. But I mean, you got to be, to my mind, it's like, oh, you got to be happy to get rid of that thing, right? Okay. I'm sure this was a time scramble and everything, and you're absolutely right. Queen d4 would be better here. And the principle that I find useful is just that in the queen ending, the centralized queen is where it's really at. Okay, here we go. Should be a draw. I commend you for playing on. Maybe the guy will screw it up. And you had some ideas here, but of course, king h4, your intention loses miserably to queen g4. Okay. Patient Chess says, I thought the idea of a4 is to play a rook a3 and knight b5. It is, and there are a lot of positions where you can do that. And the question I would say, I'll put it this way. If you are going to play a4, you need to say to yourself, this is only going to work if I can maintain a piece on b5. And the point of that piece will be to blockade the counterplay coming down. And the idea is not to hold on to the pawn, but to create a blockade where then we're going to bust him with the space and the power in the center. So, for example, a variation I switched to, actually, to my credit, I switched to, was this interesting e3 variation where a lot of times you can get stuff like, actually, there's so many variations here, but let's say g6, bishop g7, a4. And whenever he takes, we're going to take back this way. And we're just, if he does something else, like d6, yeah, sure, we'll play a move like rook a3. So you're trying to build that grip on the b5 square. And then at some point, we're going to try to say we've consolidated over there, and then we're going to bust for e4. And try to, the idea is, actually, I don't think I understood it as a kid, because it feels like your dream, because your kids dream about pawn breaks of like e4, e5, but more importantly than the break, of course, is dominating the black pieces, making them poor. And that's the problem of the Benoni, is if you get somebody who understands that and really squeezes you. Okay, let's move on. We've got Alejandro here, and I believe I should switch knight bd7 and queen d3. I'm going to call this the Yobava variation, because I've seen him do, the famous Georgian player, do this kind of thing before. And it's mildly annoying, I think, because white is just aiming for some kind of quick castles long. Okay, so the safe move is, of course, something like e6, but we see c5, snip, e6, b4. Definitely wrong, and black takes advantage of it fully with a5. This is more loss of time. Good move. Good move. And here I feel you rightly sensed that you were like, much better. We're winning here. And I think you should be winning here. And I love your next move, queen b6, where we're really putting a hurt on the dark squares. With, knight e4 is a big threat. And this great tactic where if the guy takes on f6, you've got that thing and the game's over. So he played knight f3. And should you be winning this? Absolutely. It's complete domination on the dark squares. And I didn't think of it the first time I looked at this game, but the way to conceive of it is to say that you have an extra piece on the dark squares, unopposed bishop, and because you now have the initiative, that means that the game is over. And the chess crimes that you commit have everything to do with not appreciating that. So, check to the miserable king. This is over. You would sacrifice 2 pawns to get this kind of pin. Now, you write rook a2 question mark. It's hard to imagine that move is wrong, but we're going to see maybe it makes life a little difficult. And it's not it's not immediately obvious, but we're going to see rook a2, e3, and now here's your crime. I want to see if I understand your crime fully, honestly. So let's just first look at the crime. The crime was to do that. Now, maybe you're still winning. Your position's so amazing, but, my mama said never take the pinned piece. And so the move you suggested instead of rook a2, I guess you could still do here, which is bishop c3, which I guess the main idea is to prevent bishop b5 check. I mean, the whole thing is still winning, though, right? It feels like there's got to be more than one way for making this work. Right, but okay, let's go back. This might have been machinish, but you're still winning with the human moves you did. So let's look at this bishop c3, and your point is really now that you're going to play rook a2, and there's no bishop b5 check, and therefore this is a major deal, right? And rook a2 is coming. Okay, so this has got to still be winning, but somehow, like, we lose the thread here. I got to believe there's a better move than bishop d2. I got to believe it, Queen c1, another weird move. Of course you should play rook a1. You should be winning that position. You can trade the rooks off, play king e7. His king is permanently toast. Okay. Check to the miserable king, and then this happens. Of course you missed queen a4. All right, we all do it. Let's look. We trade queens. Let's just say that was weird. More whippings. More whippings. Yeah, don't worry about the king. The king's got his own problems. Yeah, play, I don't know, king e7 is probably going to be good. Okay, so here we get this ending. White, instead of developing his bishop, plays e4. No one understands. Now, this makes no sense because now we're encouraging his bishop to develop. He says, no, I refuse. But then you develop it for him. It's all about time. Little weird. And now here I don't understand why you don't play bishop c6. Seems really natural to me. That doesn't make any sense to me. Now, one thing about this move, rook g8, is it is very clever, right? It's very clever. Let's say this, that the king moves, White's king moves, though. Clearly, when you saw them, you said to yourself, oh, I'm going to mate this dude. I'm going to mate this dude or do something with rook g8. But the real problem of this king going on his journey is that he's not paying attention to what you have going on, which is now you've got 3 pieces to escort the b-pawn down the road, and he doesn't have anything. So there's 2 possible plans you had here. I like both of them. One is bishop c6 intending something like f5, and also just now you can move the rook, or the more simplistic, you just play b5 and you march it all the way down, and it's very hard to deal with it. And I get it, you're worried about losing the h-pawn, but you've got a tiger over there. You've got a real tiger over there with that b-pawn. Okay, rook g8. It's freaking me out, of course, because you're setting yourself up. You invited the rook in for counterplay when there was no need to give him counterplay. King d8. And now another weird move, right? As you noted, you should play rook f2. And now things have gotten weird, right? Now he's got Harry the h-pawn is truly coming in here. Interesting. Check to the miserable king. And yeah, things have gone wrong. The famous blockade. Okay, so Alejandro, interesting game. And I want to say, one thing about that game, let's call it uneven. There were parts of the game where you played great, like when you exploited the b4 move and got all the dark squares. And then, I think you have a little sympathy for yourself that you played rook a2 probably quickly without realizing that he had a little bit of counterplay that way. You're still totally winning, okay? The part, though, where you trade queens and go into the endgame when the guy's wandering around as king, that should be whipping time. Whipping time, yeah. All right, Tim's been on the show many times. Let's check this out. One thing I admire about this game is that, or the annotations, let's say, is if you just breeze through the game, you can ask yourself, Tim, like, well, why'd you submit the game? It looks like you just murdered this guy. What's the question? And what I like about this game submission is that Tim is submitting a game where he potentially did lose control of the game, and I'm going to guess in a way where he became complacent after just getting a crushing position out of the opening. So let's check it out. And Black is already blundering here. We look at Morphy versus the Evil Duke as a similar position, and Bishop f3 is kind of, well, already Black's in a whole mess here, And then the engine gives knight c6 here, but let's just say that's pretty weird. Do I think, by the way, that Black has full compensation after knight c6, as Tim says here? No. Well, no, he says that. He says it's not good enough. Anyways, things have gone terribly wrong for Black, and they continue to go wrong with check to the miserable king. Knight e5 would follow if you took. Still follows. Game seems over. And right, here's where things go wrong. And one thing an advice that we give kids that I followed as a kid that I regret is we tell them to trade pieces when they're ahead. And there is some logic to this, and let me tell you what the logic is, because even as a kid I didn't get it. The logic of trading when you're ahead is that, think of it, your pieces as a force ratio, and think of it like, let's say, 25 dudes in a fight against 23, right? We've got 2 extra pawns. In that kind of scenario, you want to trade down because the ratio of 25 to 23, well, you can imagine your bros pulling it out in that kind of fist fight out on the street. But if it comes down to where something is the ratio of something like 2 to 1, or even if we start going down to 5 to 4, it's starting to be more brutal where you've got just some extra dude wandering around throwing punches. So that's the reason that it often makes sense to trade when you're ahead, and it can become simpler, right? When you're in a fight with 5 versus 4, it's just a lot simpler than, say, 25 versus 23. But, here's the key but. When we trade, when we're ahead, we often sacrifice things on a positional level in order to achieve that. And so White is still winning when he does what he does, but he's going to help Black dramatically. So the natural move, I think, was bishop b3. You're crushing the guy. Bishop on d8 is bad. King on f8 is bad. Watch what happens, though. Now the king is okay, the bishop's okay, and all of a sudden black is up in time. And Tim feels obliged to play c3. And all of a sudden, things got potentially out of hand. Knight c, rook e8, f3, another tempo, knight c6, bishop f4. And here's the interesting thing is that Tim says a careless move, but I got away with it. And the point we should really note is the carelessness came before, right? And this kind of mistake, this trading ahead when you're ahead mentality, well, it certainly has, some sense to it. Clearly it's problematic, and this is why I love the annotations here, because this is a mistake that I think everyone's made, and you got to be really aware of it. As Tim notes, bam, knight b4, and this isn't just some random thing that's happening to white. This is happening because white did not respect his pieces, right? They're all in a knot, and he's just saying to himself, I've got my 2 pawns, and I'm so proud, and I'm going to make a little shell now. Well, we've all done it, and this is the price he could have paid if black hadn't made it easy on him. And now, now we trade some more, and let's call it totally lost. Check the miserable king. Totally toast. Totally lost. And now we just move the bros up. Rook is trapped. Okay, let's go on to the next game. b3. That's a rare feature on this show. I played b3 for a while way back in the day just as a way to get interesting positions. And let's say I want to say 2 jokes. Okay, first, the person who submitted this game, his handle is 1a310, implying if you play a3 on move 1, you're going to win. Well, clearly that was his old handle, and he's moved on, right? He's moved on from this square to this square, and that's the extent of his development. Now maybe we might be moving along the board. We might go a c pawn, maybe we'll get to the d pawn in a couple of years. Now, the next thing that I found humorous about this is that I was preparing against some kid ages ago, and I noticed that they played b3. And I turned on the computer. I was like, I know that this looks good, so let's just turn on the computer and see what they say. And the thing that kind of blew my mind was that bishop d6 was playable. It blew my mind because it seems like we're inviting f4, and there's maybe some more drama than I wanted, right? Okay, so what the computer said, though, was that black's move, f6, is correct, and I think only in a computer world would I come up with, believe it. And let me see if I'm just going to try to remember it. A3 doesn't go into it, but, like, the human fear, or my fear, is, like, snip, takes, bishop e5. And on a surface level, it's just like, oh, well, we blundered that. You know what I mean? Like, oh, that was no good. But then the computer, I do remember this now, the computer said, no, bro, look at this. Queen h4, check. Queen e4, and we got to ask ourselves who's better and why. Right? Things have shifted. Things have shifted. So that's the brutal rationalization behind f6. Now, here where it's interesting is not only does a3 know about this f6, but he had already done some prep. So this was all his prep. Queen h5, provoking g6, queen f3, and then he says that e4, queen f2 is his like preparation. And so, right, it's interesting to me that that even in b3 we've got hectic opening prep, and people are aware of f6, which to me is a very computer move, because you wouldn't, at least I wouldn't even think about playing it because of what looks to be tactics gone wrong on the e5 square. Okay, so apparently his opponent knew about this too and plays bishop e6. I agree. To me, e4 looks very pleasant for black. Very pleasant, because this knight is in the way of the bishop. The knight is in the way of the c-pawn. The bishop doesn't really want to be there because it doesn't want to take anytime soon. Something like clear advantage for black. Okay, things get weird though. Queen f2, excuse me. Bishop e6, probably not terrible. It's just freaking me out a little bit because black could have taken on c6 for sure, because now his intention is, bam, king d7. It's kind of, the notes are a little confusing because now a3 says he was still in theory here, even though before he said he didn't know what to do. In any case, knight f3, it's hard to imagine this is theory. And then he mentions a game where he had it against a GM where he played knight ce2 instead of knight f3. Okay, here we go. Rook f8, knight e5, and here's where I kind of lose the thread of understanding it myself. Because knight e5, maybe this is still some theoretical thing too, but to me this looks very dangerous. And by all means, that's got to be a terrible move, because you are getting rid of that dark square bishop, and then all of a sudden the dark squares are a disaster for black, in particular these two guys. So I didn't, you know what, no, you got to take it though, right? So already in this position, the theory, the theory of 1a3 is proving amazing here. Because it's true, if you got knight f3, knight e5, and I guess he had this position before, it's a good example in openings that it's not, you know, playing the computer's best move. It's coming up with some position where you know a little bit of the tricks. And definitely a3 had it here. And I would say completely winning now. Because, yeah, that c5 square. Good. And he says he's a pawn grabber with queen a7. It's still got to be okay to play this. And you went back. Maybe you didn't need to go back, but you're still crushing it here. Like we talked about in a similar position, you you've got the dark squares and you have the initiative, and it's maybe the next move is the beginning of the crime, and I didn't plan it this way, but you and Tim did a thing here. So you said to yourself, I'm up material, and so now I want to trade stuff off. And I think you're still much better after that. Excuse me. But your advantage isn't the pawn here. Well, it's one of your advantages is the pawn. I feel like your main advantage is your king position. It's crushing, right? So I don't think black's going to survive this if you play like castles and start attacking his king. I'm going to say no way, absolutely no way. You've got the dark squares. You've got the initiative on those squares. He doesn't really have anything on the light squares. So here we go. Are you still much better? Yes. Bishop a3. Now, one thing we should say about this is it's gotten a little hectic. But the simplistic plan, if you wanted to just play for an endgame, I guess, would be rook g1, or take on e6, rook g1, and then either castle long or just start nailing going forward with the a pawn. And I gotta say you're winning. Okay, bishop a3. I still think you're much better, but now you're doing it. You clearly lost time, and you lost the g pawn, and you got this f2 rook problem. Castles and h4, and now he tricks you here with rook takes d2. And now I guess you offer to draw here because the game is over. And black took it. And one interesting thing here is I guess he might well take the thing And the reason is that his position is still very problematic. And it's actually a great example. There's several endgame studies actually that look at positions like this with the passed a pawn and you're down 1,000. You have some other problem, like in this case you've got two connected passers to deal with. But this position, right, is very difficult for black to. I don't know if he's lost, but he's got problems, right? So, anyways, maybe a small chastisement for not going forward in this position, but we can recognize, right, that you were probably shaken by the fact that you missed several tactics, and that, of course, is, anybody can miss the tactics. Like I said, it's not the tactics that I'm going to yell at you about. It's the time, and right, you gave up a lot of time in the pursuit of trading stuff, and maybe some other misconceptions. Okay, let's leave it there. We're coming up to Thad. All right, let's see what we got. We got a couple more games left, and I gotta start looking to close it out. All right, Thad is playing black, and we get an exchange variation. I think this, if you want to play against the against this knight f3, which, by the way, if someone wants to play the exchange of knight f3, you will get an interesting game. Black will make it interesting for you, and with bishop d6, black is doing that here too. Let me just give some advice to the French players. When they see this when you see this position, you could say to yourself, "Oh, my soul is dead. There's nothing to do." In fact, it always evolves into something very spicy, and you don't necessarily need to make it spicy with bishop d6. c4 is a good retort, and your bishop on d6 is a little bit funnily placed after that. But bishop d3, I've found, is also interesting. I've experimented with this as black myself, and here's my word to the wise here. The plan for white needs to be, okay, let's say the plan for black. The plan for black is knight bc6, queen d7, castles long, and then mate him. Just mate him over there, right? You might play h5, you probably play f6, g5, and so what white needs to understand pronto here is that we are in a race, and he does do it eventually, but it's going to take way too much time doing it. So it's not immediately intuitive, but there's going to be a race basically for white to get to the queen side. So a move like c3 might feel slow, but what you're doing is you're starting the drama, and the knight is usually going to come to b3, and we're going to start pressing. And especially when that knight goes to c6, we're going to use that knight to kick him out. Now, as I said earlier, in volatile positions, small mistakes are generally the end of the world. And to me, bishop g5 is a terrible move because in these positions, black usually wants to play f6 anyway. So, f6, he ends up waiting. Thad waits a move, but yes, f6. Queen d7, I like it. Castles, I like it. Queen c2, I don't like it because he's not recognizing that we're in a race. And so I guess I don't guess, I know that b4 is what you got to do. Now, Thad, you don't say anything here, but, well, you said h5 is a useful move. Yeah, I like g5 too, by the way. I like knight f5. This is terrible, and let's talk about it. He's not doing anything to you over there, first of all, with bishop f5 or anything. And that bishop on g4 has a useful function because it's going to make him think twice about knight b3, and he's going to need knight b3 later if he wants to mate you. And we're going to see some of that in the game. So here, I think with either g5, h5, or knight f5, you are firmly in control. I like knight f5 best. I'm going to vote for knight f5. You're firmly in control of the position. Maybe I'll take it back a little bit if I'm allowed to. That I'm not sure. I guess the only question I have about knight f5 is knight f5, h3, knight h4, hg, knight f3. Maybe white does survive there, so I take it back. g5 looks fine to me. All right, so bishop f5, a crime against time. All right, fg, probably a good move. And as you wrote, now the white king is a little safer. You see similar things in the Sicilian sometimes on the queen side, and white takes back CB because on AB he just might get mated a little easier. And it was certainly true that if you played HG, your H5, H4 stuff is going to be a lot more powerful. Now, let me say it. This is part of one of the things I preach. In opposite sides castling, the value of tempo goes up. That means the value of other things like pawn structure, pawns themselves, goes down. It's going to be who gets there first, who gets the initiative. Because once you get the initiative, all the black pieces or the white pieces are going to have to come back and huddle on the defense. Okay, strange move. You need to be doing your H5, G5s. You need to be opening them up. All right. A little weird, but I get it. And white finally noticed. White finally understood. By the way, knight b3. Very strong move here for white. One thing about white we'll criticize is he doesn't pursue. He starts doing weird stuff like rook a2. Okay. Good. And let's say the obvious here, that white's moves of rook a2 and g3 slowed his initiative on the queen side down, and the knight on f3 is not involved on the attack, and it's dominated by the pawns in f6 and g5. That's why the attacks on black's king probably won't work out. And so that's why you can get away with this kind of structure, because their knight, if a knight landed on c5, you can see this would be immediately over for white. But now, right, you have a chance. But a6, right, allows him to open you up. Now you've got a weakness, and I guess you're close to lost here. Interesting stuff, and then we're toast. So very interesting game, and you know when that bishop d6 system, it was clear that you knew that you knew like some of the basic ideas, and the takeaway should be that like so many of the games today and in other times on the show, it's going to be about time, but it will especially be about time with opposite sides castling and in that kind of position that you got. All right, we get de Koons, and in my memory, de Koons wipes this guy out. Let's see how it goes. c4 weird, f3 weird. Could white play already knight takes e4? Let's briefly look for the fun of everybody involved. Probably. Let's say probably. let's say more than probably. This is over. Okay. So bishop c5. Knight takes e4 still. Probably. Maybe knight takes e4 doesn't work. Anyways, white has lost time, and black's coming in. We don't understand. Mate, my friend, you resigned. That was it. I usually end the show with going over a game by Ricker, and Ricker is an older dude who's come to chess, and every show I feel he has improved. He began when he came to the show first with dropping pieces and dropping time, and now he's doing much less of both of those and becoming a much stronger player. I do him at the end of the show because he's in Indonesia, and he usually can't watch when we do it. When is the next Norm Hunter? Can you ask the bot questions? I think if you go like exclam info, does that make sense? Exclam info. You can get it. That's usually on Monday, and the famous Strong Chess has been getting trained by Kostya. All right, here we go. Good. A little strange, but you're doing fine. Good. Now, the guy, by all means, should take on f3. And let's say that what you've got here is a very nice position where you really have everything under control. But here is your moment where you need to like hold it together, right? And bishop d3 is mildly controversial because we got to wonder if he's got some kind of bishop f3 stuff of his own. So, I believe in your position here, Rickard. I really do. Let's give it a chance and say, I don't know how it would go. Let me just say this. You should be clearly better here. But even for me, it's not immediately evident how to knock this guy out, right? I know it's there, though. Let me put it that way. I know it's there. And I'm just going to guess. This is a guesstimate. The g4 is looking pretty good. It's a difficult situation. And he could have done this bishop f3 thing here. And then, you know, of course you have gf and he can't take on d4 immediately. But it's what he should be thinking of. And definitely should be thinking of it here. Because maybe he gets away with it now with bishop f3. Okay. He doesn't do it. Good move. You've got a great position. And it's strange to me that you are allowing this bishop f3 stuff. So that was the problem here. But let me just say, it's a problem common to players because, right, it's like this. There was some difficult moments where you're definitely better, but you got to hold it together. Again, g4 looks correct. Knight g5 looks weird, but we all know why you did it, right? Because you had this problem, and he didn't, you know, he didn't take advantage of it. Now he still kind of can, though, right? Because he can play moves like h6, and you're kind of back to where you started. Looks right, but you're not touching f7, right? The bishop's on h5. So here you have a problem that a lot of players have, where you didn't know what to do, right? You didn't know what to do, and it wasn't an easy position to figure it out because your knight's kind of left out to dry. Maybe f4. It's a thought. Things getting hairy. Black, I guess, should be better, but it's not clear. Good move, and I like that you're coming at the light squares. Good. Good. And now you've made immense progress, right? Immense progress. Takes, b4. Okay, things are getting hot here. Queen f5. Snip, snip. Bishop e7. And the guy needs to think about sacrificing the exchange. One move here, actually, you should consider is you should just say to yourself, white to play, and what can I do? And if you're watching this on the replay, Rickard, just pause the thing, and then you can check it out. But what you do is you go after the a-pawn, and that's going to give black a little bit of time to breathe. And I think f6, well, at least it looks very difficult for the guy after f6. You know, you're threatening a lot of stuff. Okay. So, knight b4, now he's able to cut you off a little bit, but now he's blundering here. Did you have something better? That would also be like good homework. Did you have something better than that? That was correct, though. That was good, Rickard. You got this guy. You got this guy, buddy. Now you're just wasting him. Look at that. Look at that control. Give me it all. Give it all. Done. So, Rickard, yeah, continued success. And let me say, let me give you some homework, okay? So, I love your annotations, and you're doing great. And I think the next thing for you is to try to go back and look at some of these positions and just think about how you could have played them differently. So, for example, let's say that this is a great position that you got. Ask yourself, how much better am I? Okay, and then ask yourself, what should I do? There's multiple moves I think that are reasonable here for white, but ask yourself, what do you think the best one is? And there's a couple other ones like that, like here, for example. A3 was interesting, and then also like when you played knight g5, that's another point. So what I'm recommending, this applies to everybody out there, you're going to have these difficult, complicated positions, and you're going to want to gain a sense of them afterwards using board and pieces, with the wooden pieces preferably, because the computer will tell you all kinds of things, and you just want to have a sense of how to negotiate it. And one thing here that happened is you ended up flailing against the square where it didn't do anything, right? What am I talking about? This where you started playing knight g5, right? Because and then bishop c4, because of what, you're not doing anything over there, right? He's got that square's not his weak square. Okay, everybody, let me give a couple announcements. If you want to submit a game to this show, it is going to be, in general, the last Wednesday of the month. So a good guess as to when the next show is going to be, I'll talk to the chess.com gnomes to figure it out, is going to be May 27th at 4 Eastern Time, 1 Pacific. And for those of you interested in my show, The Road Back to 2500, I'm going to do that this week. I moved it to Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. That's probably confusing to many of you, but I will post that show in its entirety on YouTube on our Chess Dojo channel. So, until next time, I hope this show is helpful to everybody. Enjoy this time. Play some classical chess. Oh, for classical chess, I want to give a shout out our Discord server. If you go to like any of our YouTube videos, there's a link to our Discord server. We're organizing tournaments for all levels of players using general classical time control. So that's just an interesting thing that's now available to people. All right, how do you submit a game? There is a forum on chess.com, and we will do a new one in probably the next day. It'll be up there. So you just go to forums on chess.com and type my last name. It should come up. All right. Thank you, everybody. I'll see you next time.